All right, we'll have to fix that in post production. Don't it'll be seamless, I promise.
There's nothing to fix. That was perfect.
Awesome. Well, hello and welcome. Well, John, our whole lives have led up to this great moment. I am excited.
Yeah, our whole lives since we were children talking about, man, it'll be so great when we have a podcast. Um I mean everybody's lives have led up to this moment, but that's okay.
Uh, uh, fair. Yeah. I
every
mean,
every
I can't think of anyone whose life hasn't led to this moment that's at least still alive, to say the least. But, and that's a good point. I mean, there's really no way to avoid that, is there?
No,
That
but the world has been waiting for something like what we are about to do.
awesome. Yeah, there's when all those little rhetorical phrases, they always drive me crazy. We could spend this whole podcast just talking about how rhetoric is the bane of my existence. But we're not here to talk about my quarrels with language. Let's get into the good stuff. How about that? So to do that, I want to start out with another meaningless quote from history. I think for thousands of years, one of the most well accepted truths across the world is credited to some guy who I don't even know how to say his name. I don't take credit for being the historian. That's why we brought you. But Heraclitus, something like that. Anyway,
Heraclitus.
Hercules. You may not recognize him, but I think you'll recognize what he's credited to say, which is change is the only constant in life. And I think it's safe to assume that most would expect a lot of changes in a church that's been around for 192-ish years. It's a long time, obviously, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is known by its members as the only true and living church, which means obviously it's 100% true. But not only that, it's also ever changing over time. And these changes are sometimes made in well circulated declarations. Sometimes they're made slowly and maybe unintentionally. They're drawn out over decades. At times, I think it's understood that some of these changes have actually been kept secret or under the rug and forgotten about by most. And I think that's kind of we're not here to kind of pull out the cobwebs or anything like that. But I think over the past 20-ish years, the church has released kind of a wave of historical documents, most of which contain contemporary records, helping us understand what happened in history, things that weren't previously known to the lay member of the church. And this information, it provides a new perspective that's really, for many, has helped them build their testimony in the church doctrine, build their testimony in the pioneer ancestry. I think it's safe to say that for others, it's kind of led to a deconstruction of their faith, or maybe a more nuanced perspective of what the gospel teachings are. And I want to start out. I'm not here to really defend or attack any side of the argument. I think it's fair that everyone has their own perspectives. But in my case, when I first encountered the gospel topic essays in the Gospel Library app, I was actually hungry for more information. I wanted to know more. I found websites, I found podcasts, I found other media that had historical sources, but all that I found, at least, they kind of seemed to have an agenda. either let's convince people the church is true, or let's convince people that the church is false. Uh, I didn't really. What I was looking for is, hey, what's out there that can just tell me what sources are out there, and not tell me, hey, this is why the church is true, or this is why the church is bad. Um, Personally, I didn't really care what the hosts of podcasts or what the authors of these articles had to say. I didn't care what they thought about it, at least. I just kind of wanted to know what's out there. Like, I mean, over the past 20 years ish, there's a lot of new information, and I didn't know how to sort through all that. So I just kind of wanted the raw information, so I could kind of decide for myself how to process this. Um, I think one source that I did find that I'll say I did like was Richard Bushman's book, With a Stone Rolling, kind of the namesake of this podcast, because I did like it so much. I think that he did. Uh, he told many of the church history accounts, doing his best to withhold his uh, personal opinions and maybe any persuasive opinions out there. So John, our intent here is to take a similar approach to Bushman, but do it podcast style. A podcast that kind of helps us understand the sources, the context, the changes, and really changes that might actually be the changes that really make this church give the church kind of the living aspect. When they say true and living phrase, what do they mean by living? Well, it's these changes that we may discuss through the course of this broadcast. So of course I can only do this with an expert, and I do not claim to be an expert or even well versed in all this content. So I am super pleased to say hello, John. Thank you again for doing this podcast with us, and here we are, the resident expert. Welcome.
Well, I'm sorry. Did you say something?
I said, John, we have to put up with you here, but now I'm going to give you a chance to talk. So I'll cut you off whenever I feel like it. And just so you know, I've got a louder voice. I grew up with more kids in my family, so I know how to cut people off pretty darn well.
I kid, of course. I was listening to everything you just said. I certainly wasn't perusing through Twitter, checking Jazz game updates. So, no, I'm kidding again. But everything you said is great. One thing that we need to do, though, before we really dive in, is we need to kind of set some ground rules, sort of formulate or frame how we're going to talk about all this stuff. And to do that, the first rule is we need to understand what history is and what it isn't. So, as you mentioned, or maybe you didn't mention, I wasn't really paying attention. I have a PhD in history. So, and I taught history for a couple of years at Arizona State. And whenever I would tell people, yeah, I'm a historian, I teach history, I would usually get one of two answers. The first would be, oh, I love history. I watch the History Channel all the time, which is great. Good for you. Second answer would be, oh, I can't stand history. I'm just not good with dates. And that's not as good, right? But most people think of history as just something that it's past, it's done, and so it's simple. So, in fact, a famous moron once said, history is real simple. You know what history is? It's what happened. And if anyone can tell us who actually said that, let's give him extra points, Tyler. But the phrase implies that history is simple, it's straightforward, it's done, it's past. We can understand it and we move on. This is what happened, done, period. It's just a series of events that happened. But it implies that if we have a question about whether or not something like if Hitler was an alien, or if we're going the Mormon route, what did Brigham Young eat for breakfast? All we have to do is look in someone's journal, done, that's it. So why is that a problem to do it that way? um, mostly because it focuses merely on facts: what happened, who did it, and when. It completely ignores the why and the significance. And that's really what doing history is all about. It's not so much having things memorized, dates, facts, people. It's more about being able to study and analyze and put things into context. So, again, a lot of times when I tell people I teach history, they would ask me questions like, "Oh, um, where was Hitler's mom from?" Or first of all, let me back up a bit.
Germany.
Everyone's everyone's obsessed with Hitler. It always comes back to either World War II or the Civil War. But anyway, history isn't that simple. That's not history. That's Wikipedia type stuff. People aren't simple, right? So history isn't either. And when we look at history in that kind of way, like this happened and it led to the next thing, and it led to the next thing, it diminishes a lot of the voices and the nuance, specifically, marginalized voices, people who didn't really have a voice back then. It silences them, and we don't really know what their experience was, and therefore we don't have a full picture. And the key, though, is that we lose the ability to identify with it, and that's really what history is all about, is exploring the humanity of people who came before us. And so if we're silencing voices, if we're cutting things out, then we diminish our ability to identify with the people who came before us. If we can't see ourselves in it, then it loses its appeal and it loses its purpose. So I'll just breeze through one more thing. A lot of times growing up, we learn history through textbooks, lectures, and tests. And that's okay because it lays a good groundwork for what we can build off of. But it doesn't do a very good job of fostering conversation, which is what we're trying to do here. That learning history that way reinforces that assertion that history is real simple. It's what happened mentality, and it forces us to ignore important things. So why do we bother to study history? It's, first of all, history is a tool for changing how we think, for promoting literacy, not so much of names and dates, but more of discernment and judgment and caution. A lot of times, especially in church history, we talk about great examples that have gone before us, things that we should be doing. But there's also lessons there that teach us what not to do. History teaches us how to make choices, how to balance opinions, how to tell stories, and how to be uncomfortable, frankly, things that we learn. And it humanizes us in a way that few other things can. Anyway, so how do we study history? Everyone's familiar with the victor tells the story, right? Whoever wins history tells it. It's sort of like in Rocky IV. You familiar with Rocky IV, Tyler?
I know the Rocky series.
Okay,
Don't quiz me pop culture. Don't quiz me pop culture. I don't know who the bad guy is in Rocky IV.
Well, in Rocky IV, Rocky wins the Cold War, essentially. He beats Ivan Drago in Moscow and essentially overthrows communism. At the end of the fight, everyone's chanting for Rocky. And so he wins. So that's how the story is told, right? That's really not the way it works, right? There's kind of two ways to approach history. There's the strange aspect of it, the part that we're not so familiar with, and then there's the familiar aspect of it, the part that we're comfortable with. And this is especially applicable in how we approach church history. So the familiar aspect of history entices us with the promise that we can locate our own place in a stream of time and solidify our identity, right? It's the stories that we grow up with hearing, and these stories in some way inspire us and become part of our character and a part of our identity. But when we do that, it's great. It's a great practice, but it turns history into just a commodity for instant consumption. and that can lead to ignoring vast regions of the past that either contradict our current needs or don't align with them. And it becomes easy to contort the past to what we want it to be instead of stretching our understanding. So then there's the strange aspect of studying history, which is exciting. It can be fun. It's learning new things, but it often results in a kind of it can be easy to dismiss, I guess. And the truth is, we need to do both. We need to reconcile two contradictory positions. We need to bring in the familiar and commingle it with the strange aspects. And for church members, we often want to justify some of the actions and events that past church leaders have done. We want to explain away some of their behaviors. But we still need to try to put those modes of thinking, our modes of thinking, aside to understand how people of the past saw their world. When we look at history, we're not only going back in time, but we're going back to a foreign land with a language that we don't speak. I don't know if you just saw my son walked in. He wanted to say hi. So
Hi, son.
Yeah, then he slowly backed out. Anyway, even going back 20 years, when we talk to our kids about life without cell phones, I think, Tyler, you and I are old enough to remember a little bit of life before the internet. So when we talk to our kids about that, they just can't comprehend it. And that's only, 20, 25 years ago. So when we do it, 200, and in today's episode, 2,000 years ago, that just compounds it even more. So the point of all this is to say that it's great to be familiar with history. It builds our identity. It gives us something to aspire to, or it can. But there's also a strange and unfamiliar concept that we also have to embrace. We have to learn to be uncomfortable with things if we truly want to have an understanding of what happened in the past. And the key to that, I think, is to just be sympathetic. Just like when we're trying to understand people today in our own time, people we live with, it's, I think, very beneficial to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that can go a long way in understanding people of the past as well. Any questions on any of that?
Yes. Next time, first off, thank you, John. Great. I love saying the ground rules, and I agree with everything that I understood you said. My only question is, if you're going to go on that long and talk again, can you give me a heads up? Because I've got some pretty cool things I can do while you're talking to make it a little more enjoyable.
Enjoyable for you?
For everybody.
Okay.
Just this nice little music as you're talking,
to lull people to sleep. Yeah. No, I thought you were going to interrupt me at some point because you kept saying, "Oh, I grew up with tons of siblings. I'm going to interrupt you." But
I have to know what they're talking about first. I just don't know history.
Okay.
So,
all right. I won't talk that long again.
No, that was great. That was great. I just want to also encourage, if people are on streaming and they do have questions, feel free to interrupt John with your questions. Just chat them in the thing. We'll get to them as we can.
Yes, all three of you.
Up to 4. We're making progress.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes. No. So yeah, I think that's great. I think just to help me kind of summarize this, basically, it's important to recognize that we're viewing history kind of from our viewpoint with prejudices. Studying history will help us kind of gain a better understanding of their perspectives and their the context that they were in, more so than just putting them into kind of our world. Is that? I know you said a lot there, but that's kind of what I took away from it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's definitely that's great. I like that you use the word prejudice, because prejudice, we often think of it as a derogatory view towards something or someone or whatever. But in this case, the way you used it, and I think the more correct term, is that we have our own perspectives, our own viewpoints, our own framework for looking at things, and history is great because it challenges us to kind of fade those out, so, and to have a little bit more of an open mind, and to look
Cool.
at things from a different perspective.
Cool. Well, let's jump into it then. That's a great introduction. Kind of help people understand where we're coming from when we're talking about these things from a not from a over the pulpit perspective, but more from a historical perspective. I think that's a great introduction to help us kind of understand where we're coming from. So I appreciate that. So what can you tell us then? We've titled this episode the history of Jesus Christ. So kind of maybe we'll jump in, I guess, talking about Jesus Christ, and more so to help understand the context. What was the environment that he was born into?
Yeah. So when we started talking about how we were going to do this, we wanted to do church history. And when I studied history, I had a problem of having to always go back further, right? I'd start diving into a topic and then I'd be like, well, how did we get to this point? And so I'd have to keep going back. And so I thought, let's just start at the beginning, and see where it all comes from. So with these shows that we're doing, the idea is to focus on specific sources that give us an idea of what was going on at the time, right? So we do have those sources and we're going to get to them, but first we have to lay some groundwork and provide some context. So to do that, we're going to start with Palestine at the time of Jesus. And we are super high tech here, and it's going to, the people who are just listening are going to maybe be kind of frustrated, but I want to show a map of what was Palestine at the time. Oh, there it is. Okay. This is how high tech we are. This is a professional podcast that we're doing here. So as you can see, there's the Dead Sea, Judea. Palestine is broken up into different quadrants or tetrarchs. There's Judea here, the tetrarchy of Philip over here, Syria's up here, Galilee, and Idumea is down here. There's Jerusalem, to give you some context. Galilee is up here. We're going to be talking a lot about Galilee today. That's the region of Nazareth, where Jesus is from. Any questions on that? Any questions about the map, I guess?
I'm just impressed. How did you get that technology to work?
I know. Well, when we talked about doing this, I wanted to make sure that we do it right. Okay, so we know from the Hebrew Bible that Jews have been conquered over and over and over again for hundreds of years. But finally, in the year 164 BCE, the Jews finally gained independence. And they kept it for almost 100 years.
Okay. So can I jump in just 1 second? I think I might have missed this primary lesson, and I feel like it's a super basic question. But can you help me understand what you mean when you say the Jews gained independence? Is this a government? Is it? I mean, I'm certain Jews is a religion. Is it a society, ethnicity, race, government? What exactly do you mean when you're saying the Jews gained independence here?
Yeah, great question. So a great way to think about it is just a kingdom. They establish a kingdom. Don't ask me who the king is because I didn't write it down. But they establish an independent kingdom, right? And it's It's not a democracy or anything like that. It's a straight up kingdom. Race might be a complicated way to describe them because that term is more of a 19th, 20th century construct. They would not have thought of themselves as a specific race, maybe more of a tribe, right? They wouldn't have thought of themselves as a religion either, because again, that's a social construct that comes hundreds of years later. So this is a good example of what we're talking about earlier, of looking at things through the lens of the past. Religion is something that didn't exist. Race is something that didn't exist. This is merely just a group of people. It's a diverse group of people, but they are held together by some sort of commonality in their beliefs, but also through their allegiance to a king, to a monarchy. So to describe them as a race, it probably wouldn't have helped very much. Does that make sense?
I think so. It's a kingdom.
Yes. Yeah. So almost 100 years after they gain this independence, a civil war breaks out, and both factions appealed to Rome for help. And you and I know, having just known a little bit about Rome, we would know that that's a huge mistake, because Rome takes it as an invitation to come in and take control, which they do. Rome finally takes over and forces the Jewish people to start paying tribute. And during this time, Rome establishes it's kind of they call it a kingdom, but it's more of a puppet state. They put a king in charge named Herod, and Herod was a big time fan of Rome. He builds lots of Roman type cities across Palestine, and he's perfectly fine paying a tribute to Rome because he can impose taxes, and so the people of Palestine are paying taxes to Herod, who then pays a tribute to Rome. And a lot of the Palestinians saw Herod as an outsider because of this. He was sympathetic to Rome, so he wasn't very popular. But he did do something that they all kind of really liked, which was he built the temple, or at least expanded it. He made it into this really ornate, huge, not just building, but social, sort of social capital, I guess. It might be the right word. Everything revolves around the temple. It controls the economy. It controls people's, their calendars, all these types of things. It's the center of everything. And Herod is often credited for making it that way. Anyway, Herod passes. Go ahead.
So sorry. When we talk because I remember learning about temples, ancient temples, and so that's a Roman it came in with the Romans with King Herod. Is that what you're saying?
So,
or they had the temple, and then when Herod came, he changed the functionality and the purpose of it.
Yeah. So he basically, it was there. It was a part of society, but what he did was he enlarged it in every way imaginable. Okay. If that makes sense. Yeah. So we can't just think of the temple as a building. It's its own entity, basically. You have priests there who are ruling the temple, who are controlling the temple. They're the ones that demand sacrifices, or at least animals to be sacrificed. They're the ones that are asking for tithing, I guess, although it would be a different concept of the way we think about it. Tribute, I guess, is probably a better word. But yeah, so Herod is the one that enlarges it in every way, for good and bad.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. He did put sort of a Roman flair to it. So Rome, one good thing that they did was that as long as you kind of towed the line, They were fine with you worshiping your own God however you wanted. And so, but they also wanted to sort of put their stamp on it. So a good example of this would be that, like, the temple of Herod had the Roman eagle above the gateway to it, just to kind of symbolize that this is your place, but not really. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yes, it's yours, but I want to make sure that you know it's mine.
Yeah.
So
It's yours, but we're the ones in control.
I want to celebrate our first question from the audience. When did Herod become the leader of we're talking Jerusalem? Are we
Yeah.
talking
So
Jerusalem?
we're talking about Palestine.
Palestine. Okay, so
Yep.
Jerusalem's within Palestine, right? You showed
Yes.
me the map, and I couldn't see it. I'm not gonna lie, it was too small. So Palestine's bigger. Jerusalem is inside Palestine. Gotcha. So when did Herod become the leader of Palestine? Then.
So this is all Palestine, and Herod controlled all of it. He became
Gotcha.
ruler in the year 37 BC. I'm pretty sure.
37 BC. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
And thank you for questions. If as they come, feel free to throw them in there.
Yeah. So Herod passes away, and one more important thing that I need to say about Herod. He was very popular with the Romans because when he controlled Palestine, he kept everything in order. He was very he carried a big stick, he did not put up with bandits, with uprisings, especially from the smaller backwater cities around Palestine. Because, like we talked about, Palestine and the Jews had been conquered and reconquered over and over again, and there were always uprisings. And Herod was popular with Romans because he didn't put up with any of that. He was very, very strict. So he dies, and he has three sons. There's Herod Antipas, who is the Herod that we're familiar with from the New Testament. There's another one named Archelaus and Philip, and they are all given control of different parts of Palestine. Herod Antipas is given control over the Galilee area, so where Jesus grew up. And these divisions, as you can probably guess, did not go over very well with the Jews. They didn't really go over well with the Romans either, because these three sons just weren't as powerful as Herod the Great was. So as their control kind of slips away, you get more and more uprisings, and Rome sort of tightens its grip over Palestine. Plus, there's a drought that happens, and that sort of compounds all of the problems. People get upset. Whenever people are hungry, they tend to revolt. So you have this drought. You have Rome tightening its grip over Palestine. You have, and Palestine's not a rich area. So you have these poor farmers who are forced to pay taxes, tithing, and a tribute. They're taxed right out of their property. There's a growing wealth disparity. And so you get a stronger nationalist movement. And that nationalist movement is frequently fueled by the concept of a Messiah. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But any questions on that? I'll pause and make sure we're still good.
Yeah, I think we're in good shape.
Okay, cool. So let's get into the temple a little bit more. As I said, it was the center of Jewish life. It's the largest financial institution, and it keeps the priests who run the temple very wealthy. They took donations from the people who would come, and they would eat the sacrifices. People would come in, they bring their sheep or their birds. The priests would take the animals, they sacrifice it, complete the prayer that the donor had asked them to complete, and then they would eat the sacrifice. So it's basically these rich guys taking this free food and having a barbecue with it.
All right, you asked for questions 30 seconds too early because I've got one now.
Okay.
These priests would, when we talk about the church being the same church that exists in the primitive church, namely apostles, I think priest is in that list, or if not, I imagine priest is the same title. Is that priest the same title as the priest in the current church today, or is it just kind of completely different?
Yeah, I would say it's completely different.
Okay. Okay.
I mean,
So I
there's
can't say, hey, I'm a priest. Come bring me some food, and then I'll cook it in the backyard. That wouldn't work. You're saying?
I mean, you could.
I don't.
It'd be an interesting social experiment, I guess, that you're restoring the ancient religion of the Jews, and as the priest, you demand that people bring in sacrifices. That could be fun to see how that goes. But no, it's a completely different concept.
All right. Well, you can keep talking. I'm going to ponder that for the rest of this episode, and I'll tune back in when you're done because I think you're going somewhere there. That sounds like it has potential there.
Okay, sounds good. So the person in control of all of this, the whole temple, is the high priest, right? And the high priest is not somebody who's elected or appointed by God like we might think of it. The high priest is actually appointed by Rome, and the office could be bought. And so you have these rich families who are always sort of grappling to get into that spot. But the high priest is essentially the spiritual leader of the Jewish nation. And as you can imagine, many of the Jews were not really into that. You know, they would consider him to be corrupt and in league with Rome. And he, there's this rich religious leader who's taking their donations and living a very lavish lifestyle, who's in the pocket of Rome. So you can imagine that went over pretty well. These poor farmers paying tithing to an already rich priesthood.
I think, John, I've seen enough Monty Python to think that was kind of normal for poor people to be paying the rich people. Would this be something that's new and kind of distasteful to them, or do you think they just thought that's the way life was?
Kind of both.
Okay.
But
That's the way life is, but it's unfair.
Yeah, yeah. But with the Jews, you have that extra flair of the concept of the Messiah, right? So you have these Old Testament prophets. We'll talk about the Hebrew Bible a little bit. Old Testament. You have these ancient prophets who always talk about a Messiah coming to restore the kingdom of Israel. Now, the thing we need to think about, though, is that the Jews, Israelites, are not a homogenous society, right? Again, this goes back to the idea of a religion. When we think about religion, we think about sort of a group of uniform people who all think the same thing. That is not the case. Again, religion didn't exist. You have a very diverse group of people who are kind of bound together by old texts and the temple. But there's different ways of interpreting that text. So there's at least 24 different Jewish factions. There's the Pharisees. The three big ones are the ones that we hear about all the time: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Pharisees they appeal more to like the lower and middle class. They're rabbis that kind of interact with the commoners. The Sadducees are the ones that control the temple. They're more conservative, they're wealthier, and they're friendly with Rome. And the Essenes are kind of just out on their own, doing their own thing.
All right. So I'm gonna jump in with my expertise here because I am an expert at this. I recall the Sadducees don't believe in the afterlife. Is that they don't believe in something, and that's why they're Sadducee. I think it was the afterlife, but it may have been something else. All I remember is that's why they're Sadducee from my days long ago.
They're Sadducees.
I'm not an expert. Did they believe in the afterlife?
That's a good question.
Okay.
I don't think they believed in the resurrection.
The resurrection, that would make more sense. They don't believe in the resurrection. That's why they're Sadducee. There you go.
Yeah. So if I remember right, So the Sadducees, they followed the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And that's where it ends, if I remember right. They don't believe in anything after that. And so along with that, there's no concept of immortality or resurrection. But yeah, that's a good question. We may have to look
I'm
into
never
that.
I'm never going to pretend to be the expert again, because that just popped in my head. This quote from probably high school seminary, I'm guessing. I don't know where that came
Yeah.
from.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing everything to a grinding halt, Tyler. But
I can make it better. Hold on. Let's see.
we can
This one sounds good.
we can edit this all out. Yeah.
All right, back to business.
Okay, so anyway, so there's all these different factions of Jews, and as a result, you have lots of different ideas of what the Messiah would be. Some believe him to be a political leader, a warrior. Others believe him to be a divine being. Others, there's just lots of different ways of thinking about a Messiah, but there are sort of 3 commonalities among these different factions. First of all, the Messiah had to be a descendant of David. He had to restore Israel. He had to free the Jews and establish God's kingdom in Jerusalem. I guess that's 4 commonalities, but those are the 4 things that kind of overlap among all these different factions. So the Messiah would be a spiritual leader and a political leader, but he didn't necessarily need to be a divine being. Any questions about that?
Yeah. So when the way I understand, or the way I've been taught, maybe I understand, Jesus came, and I'm jumping ahead to 60 years or 50, 40 years from wherever we're talking now, but Jesus came, and as I understand, he quoted Isaiah a lot, saying that Isaiah prophesied of the Messiah coming, and in that context, it was a divine being, as you're saying. So
Mm-hmm.
based on this history um, that you're referring to, you're saying it's not necessarily a divine being. Did they interpret Isaiah to mean something differently, or would they have just kind of um, would they have just thought of it different? I don't know. I don't know what question I'm asking there, but it's, to me, when it's taught to me, it's kind of pretty clear. Oh yeah, they all knew that the Savior was coming because Isaiah taught it. Do the documents that you're referring to explain that, well, really that wasn't the way they saw it, or is there something else that I'm missing?
Yeah, so great question. The way we're taught, whenever we're taught about Isaiah, we're taught that he prophesies of the Christ, right? Which is different than the concept of a Messiah. So Isaiah certainly leaves room for thinking of the Messiah as a divine being, but Isaiah also refers to Cyrus, the king of Persia, as a Messiah. And he's a conqueror. They're certainly not going to believe him to be the son of God, right? Or maybe they did in some ways. But a Messiah is just basically anyone who can lead the Jews into glory. And the reason why Cyrus was considered a Messiah is because he kind of restored religious freedom, or I keep using that term, even though it didn't exist, but he let them, believe in what they wanted, if that makes sense. So again, we're used to thinking of Israelites and Jews as being this uniform group and having a very regimented set of beliefs. But again, that's just not the case. There's a lot of diversity there and a lot of different ways of interpreting Isaiah and the definition of a Messiah.
Right. You mentioned organized religion doesn't exist. What was their view of like God and potentially heaven and hell, that sort of thing? What was their, just in one phrase, what was their view of religion at that time?
It was just a way of life. It's just the way things are, right? There's a God. So I'm not super. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask. They believed in one powerful Almighty God versus multiple gods or anything like that.
Yeah. So again, great question. And I'm not this isn't my area of expertise, but I do know that the early Israelites were what's the word? They were not monotheists.
Okay.
What's the opposite of a monotheist? Do you remember?
Polytheists?
Yeah, they were polytheists. Yep. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that they not only worshipped Jehovah, but they worshipped his female partner as well. And that kind of went away through the years. But the sort of transition into a monotheistic group comes with Elijah. You remember Elijah, he was very, very dedicated to Yahweh or Jehovah. So much so that he eggs on the priests of Baal to, try to bring fire down from heaven. And when they don't, he shows them up. He asks Jehovah to do it. Jehovah brings fire down on a completely wet bonfire. And then he has the priests of Baal killed, all 400 something of them. So Elijah is sort of a key moment in Jewish history, in the shift from, at least maybe they didn't worship different gods, but they believed in them. And Elijah represents a shift from believing in these other gods and maybe sometimes worshiping them to complete dedication to Yahweh.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Good question. Not really my area, but it's a fun discussion, I guess.
I'll find a better PhD to ask next time.
Yeah. we really should find a guest or something.
No,
okay,
sincerely, you're doing great. I don't. I jest, but that's all it is.
Yeah, I'm all you got right now. So anyway, yeah. So there's a diversity of opinion and beliefs about the Messiah, and the Jews, for the most part, they believe the Messiah to not just be a leader against Rome, but also the Jewish elite, the temple priests. And if you were to call yourself a Messiah, which there were many people who did, lots of different backwater guys who came out of nowhere and tried to lead an uprising who called themselves a Messiah, that was basically calling or committing treason, especially against Rome. Maybe not so much against the temple priests. To them, it was more of an annoyance and sort of a challenge to their authority. But Rome, again, let's not forget, they're the ones that they have control over Palestine. And to have a Messiah come up and challenge their authority, well, they're the government entity, right? And if you have somebody challenging that, well, then that's treason.
Did they believe that a Messiah was prophesied at that point, the Romans?
No, they. Okay. Yeah, that's more like, well, the Jews believe in this silly concept. And if you would go around the Roman Empire, I'm sure you'd see other groups of people that they had conquered that would have similar beliefs.
I got you.
Okay, so let's get into Jesus, the person, now. And a little bit of background.
Oh, I got a shiver when you said Jesus, the person.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by Jesus, the person, just to be clear?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a huge topic, right? So there was at one point a man whose name was Jesus of Nazareth. And again, taking a purely historical view, over the centuries, he changed from being Jesus of Nazareth to Jesus the Messiah to Jesus the Christ. Right? So right now, we're going to start with Jesus the person, a person named Jesus who was born in Palestine, roughly the year 0.
Okay.
The baby, right? So again, a little bit more context. There's 4 gospels, all written around kind of the same time, but Mark is the earliest, written in about 70 CE by a Jewish man. He doesn't really mention Jesus's birth. And originally, the Gospel of Mark ends in chapter 16, verse 8, which, if you look it up, it comes short of talking about the resurrection. It mentions an empty tomb, and that's it. Everything that came after was added later. And then Matthew and Luke build off of Mark. So Matthew is probably written around 90 or 80 to 90 CE by a Jewish man, and Luke probably a little bit later. Luke was originally thought to be Paul's companion in Acts, but most scholars don't really buy into that anymore. And then there's this fifth source that scholars just refer to as Q. And this is a theoretical source that Matthew and Luke take from. So Mark is kind of on his own. Matthew and Luke take from Mark, but then they also take from somewhere else. And scholars refer to that source as Q.
Gotcha. John, we are running short on time, and I've got a somewhat hard end time. I do have one question, but it sounds like this is going to take quite a bit of time to cover all of this. So maybe we will cover my question, because if it's my question, it's probably pretty important. And and then maybe we'll hold off to the next episode to really delve into more about these gospels. So, but since you brought up the the Mark first, then Matthew and Luke, and the Q source, it's pretty easy to assume that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. But then you say that they were written 70 to 100 years after Jesus was born. Did these disciples have a voice in these scripture, or was it just written by people who said what they thought the perspective of these disciples would be?
Yeah, good question. So it's certainly possible and probably likely that there were people named Mark, Matthew, and Luke who spread the news about Jesus. But again, we have to change our concept of what authorship is. Right now, if you were to say I wrote this, but it was really written by, like, if I were to say, Tyler, this is the book of Tyler, but I wrote it, people would say, well, then you can't call it the book of Tyler because Tyler didn't write it. But 2,000 years ago, that would be totally acceptable because I know you. I know Tyler. I've talked to him. I've heard some of his stories. I even saw some of them. And so I'm perfectly within my rights to write something about it. Now, we don't really know who the people were who wrote these gospels, who actually put pen to paper or quill to parchment in this case. But that doesn't matter. The point is that they were taking from these traditions from people who either experienced them firsthand or heard them pretty soon afterward. It's all very messy, to be honest, and it's hard to wrap your head around it, our head around it 2,000 years later. But the concept of the authorship is to early Christians, it would not have been that important, to be honest, because it's more important. The message is the most important thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Appreciate the insight. Is there anything else you want to touch on? Like I say, this sounds like we could go on maybe a whole nother hour on this alone. I don't know if that's the plan, but I do want to give you a chance if there's anything else you want to talk about before we wrap this up.
No, I'm sorry, we didn't get to the actual historical Jesus very much, but this is a good teaser for next episode, where we will bring in the two sources that I wanted to dive into. The first one is a guy named Josephus, and the second is a guy named Tacitus. And they both talk about Jesus, and they are both not in the Bible.
I look forward to it. Thanks. Great job, John. I appreciate your time. Appreciate your insights. This has been, I learned quite a bit over the last hour, so I appreciate you doing this. But it is an hour past my bedtime, so I must go. So thanks, everyone. Feel free to join us next Sunday on the live stream, 7 o'clock Mountain Time, 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Or you can find us anywhere you find your podcasts.
Yeah, and leave a review.
Oh, we should do the whole "we're a podcast. This is important to us." I don't know this. I don't know what to do. Leave a review. If it's 5 stars, leave a review. It's not, then I don't know if it matters.
If you can't say something nice, don't say anything.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'll just insert anything you've ever heard from a podcast. Them begging you to do something. Do it for us too, because it's probably a good thing.
Tell your friends.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tyler.
You guys will have to give me feedback on my little sign off. Life's rough. Roll on. Thank you. I'll see y'all.
See you, Tyler.